Someone requested that I take a look at this video right here from Shaun, the Skull Shaun, so I'm going to refer to him as. He has 366,000 subscribers on YouTube, and as you can see with this video right here, it's about how privatization fails, and he discusses the railways in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to start by discussing the history of railroads in the United States, particularly 19th century America. I'm going to be comparing and contrasting the major railroads that were started and heavily subsidized by the federal government, and one major railroad that was completely privately funded and built with zero subsidies. I'm going to bring up this book right here called Myth of the Robber Barons by Burton Folsom. So basically, in the mid-19th century, the United States government passed what is called the Pacific Railroad Act with the goal of creating the nation's first transcontinental railroad. Now, why did Congress want to do this? According to Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, it was for national prestige and perhaps the economy. It's going to be great for the nation and the economy. The Pacific Railroad Act led to the creation of the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad, and Congress wanted these railroads to be built as swiftly as possible, offering handsome rewards in return for speedy construction. Right away, this led to a lot of long-term problems because the companies laid their tracks as fast as possible, often neglecting the quality and durability of the tracks, eventually leading to costly repairs, maintenance, and downtimes for the railroad. Congress also offered their rewards based on mileage, which incentivized these companies to unnecessarily construct longer routes. And despite over $60 million in cash loans fronted by the American taxpayers, along with 44 million acres in free land as a reward, both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads struggled to stay afloat, both almost going bankrupt upon completion, which should not be a surprise because why build a railroad for things like consumer demand and efficiency and durability in the pursuit of long-term profits and growth when you can just schmooze some politicians into greasing the taxpayers for your company? A similar situation happened with Henry Villard's Northern Pacific Railroad, who managed to obtain federal subsidies to build a long, scenic railroad route through the American Northwest. By 1893, the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad would go bankrupt, while the Central Pacific Railroad had to be rescued by private investors, all three of which were long plagued with failure and scandals. I'm barely scratching the surface on how horribly these government-funded railroads operated and the consequences. Now contrast these failed railroads with James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad. You know, I often see comments from dim-witted socialists who like to argue that under capitalism, under free markets, that it's impossible for poor people to become rich. It's impossible to become part of what is called the ownership class. It's impossible for people to move up the so-called economic ladder. Well, one example that debunks this myth is James J. Hill, who, as you can see, grew up poor, mostly raised by a single mother, to the point where he had to help support his family by working at a grocery store for $4 a month. James J. Hill would go on to build a railroad that extended all the way from St. Paul, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington, doing so with zero government assistance, taking his time to make sure that he was building sound, solid railroad tracks, attracting immigrants to build communities along the way, and eventually opening the door for more international trade with Asian countries. And to make things more difficult for James J. Hill, Henry Villard and the Northern Pacific Railroad, having the political pull that they had, managed to get in the way of James J. Hill's ambitions from time to time. And while all of these government-funded railroads were failing and going bankrupt and crawling back to Congress Congress to beg for more government handouts, James J. Hill's railroad was actually making money. They were making profits despite cutting costs and offering lower prices for consumers. Bert Folsom also contrasts the shipping industry in America in the early 19th century, comparing government-backed ships with Cornelius Vanderbilt's privately funded and operated shipping fleet, and how Vanderbilt outperformed these government-subsidized ships while offering lower prices for consumers. And again, this is all from Bert Folsom's book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, a book that I highly recommend, especially for those who are interested in history and economics, where he goes into much greater detail on these issues. But this all brings me back to Shaun's video about privatizing the railroads in the United Kingdom. I decided not to do a typical rebuttal video to this because I don't know much about the UK's railroad industry, and it would take a lot of time and a lot of resources that I don't have to tackle this issue. In fact, I'm mainly relying on Wikipedia as a source, which I know is controversial to a lot of people, but if you watch Shaun's video, he too relies on Wikipedia, so I say tit for tat. But nevertheless, Shaun mainly makes his argument about economics and safety and efficiency. And there's an entire Wikipedia page on this topic alone, as you can see right here. And there seems to be a lot of evidence that since privatization, and I use privatization in quotes because the trains in the UK are still heavily regulated and subsidized. But it does look like that privatization has led to an increase in customer satisfaction, as you can see right here. And it looks like that safety has improved. Apparently, the UK's railroad system is the safest in all of Europe. It looks like the issue of fares and prices is disputable. In some cases, fare prices have went down. In other cases, fares have increased. Another good example of privatization of success in railroads is Japan, who, with the exception of a few lines, privatized their national railroad system in 1987, and it looks like that their railroad system is now the envy of the world, as you can see right here. The 51 busiest train stations in the world, all but 6 are located in Japan. My buddy Frog Machinery, who has a YouTube channel, I suggest you guys go check him out, but he has lived in Japan for 7 years, and I asked him what he thought about Japan's railroad system, and he was telling me how wonderful the train system is there. He says if a train is late, they apologize, and they even offer to provide certificates to show your boss if you happen to be late for work because of the trains running late. He also mentioned an instance where the trains were down temporarily for maintenance, and the company provided buses to fill the demand until the trains were back up and running. He says that the trains have rechargeable ports, they have comfortable seating, electronic toilets, vending machines, and even areas for Wi-Fi internet. And I know this is anecdotal evidence, but finding information on Japanese trains is not easy, so take it for what it's worth. According to this article, it looks like the Japanese trains are very profitable. And according to Statista, it looks like Japan ranks ahead of the world in terms of efficiency. And I've heard other people argue that with the advent of the bullet train and other technology, that Japan leads the world in innovation when it comes to railroads. But our good friend Skull Shaun makes it sound like that trains are too complicated of an undertaking for the private sector to handle. This, of course, ignores the fact that even the British railroads were not always nationalized. In fact, much of the British railroads were built by private companies with private investment. And the railroads were not even nationalized until the 1940s, which actually came 20 years after the government had already intervened to consolidate the railroads with the Railways Act of 1921, which some consider to be the stepping stone toward complete nationalization of the British railroads. But putting all of the economics aside, my question is, by what right did the British government have to take over private companies in the first place?
You know, that's a really good question.
Thinking back to James J. Hill, would it have been right for the United States government to take over James J. Hill's railroad after he had privately built it himself?
Yeah, to the no, yeah, to the no, to the no, no, no.
which did happen to an extent. The United States government was very eager to impose price controls and other regulations on James J. Hill with the passage of the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Hepburn Act.
Now that's fucked up.
James J. Hill was also a target of Teddy Roosevelt's crusade against trusts. A power-lusting nationalist who's trying to use antitrust as an excuse to bully private businesses and creators. Sound familiar? Anyway, our good friend Skull Shaun could talk about efficiency and economics and hypotheticals all he wants, but the fact remains that the British government never had the right to nationalize the railroads in the first place. The proper role of government is to protect the individual's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property and happiness. Your existence on Earth does not entitle you to a means of transportation at the expense of your neighbors. People like Skull Shaun have to turn this into a pissing match about economics and efficiency to convince you to give up your property, give up your freedom, and maybe even destroy some people that he hates in the name of helping society. And there's even a point where Skull Shaun over here throws individualism into the garbage. Let's take a listen.
So why was the system privatized in the first place? Now, I could just say money here and end the video. That would be pretty funny. But it's a little deeper than that, actually. The privatization of British Rail was just one part of an ideological push towards an idea of free market individualism, typical of the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, which is why she got on Jen's wonderful thumbnail for this video, even though British Rail was actually privatized a few years later under John Major. It was privatization as ideology. Whether the changes actually made sense to implement or not didn't really matter. The individual is everything, and society doesn't even exist, actually. Margaret Thatcher once said, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." Now, the problem with this line of thinking, obviously, is that it's a load of old shit. But it's not hard to see why people who think like that...
So my question is, why is this a load of old shits? Now, I'm not a big fan of Margaret Thatcher. I don't know much about her politics, but I would say that she's on the right track. I would say that society is a collection of individuals, and I would take it a step further and say that individuals in society should be free to deal with one another through reason and voluntary trade. I mean, which society would you rather live in? One that's predicated on reason and voluntary trade, or one that's predicated on force? It should really come as no surprise that that societies that embrace reason and individualism, they get train systems like Japan's that are the envy of the world, whereas societies that embrace Skull Shaun's garbage ideology of subordinating the individual's rights and interests to society, well, they get trains that head to the gulags and concentration camps.